Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's College Board webinar, Optimizing Search for International Student Recruitment. We're so glad that you could join us today. Just a quick couple of reminders before we get started with the session. We will be recording today. Recording has started, so we will be able to distribute this recording to all participants, and we will send the deck following today's session. So please feel free to use the chat and the Q&A functionality in the meeting to send any questions our way as we get into the presentation. We will follow up with questions, as many of them as we can, at the end of the presentation. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to introduce my colleague, Clay Hensley, who's going to kick us off.
Thank you, Carolyn. Oh, what a great pleasure of working with you, working with my colleague Scott, and then addressing everyone today who's joined us for this webinar. I hope everyone's staying safe and strong and sane during these very strange, surreal times that we're in. Our topic today, optimizing search for international student recruitment. So let's get going. So I'm Clay Hensley. I'm a senior director in the international division of the College Board. I've been with the College Board for approaching 2 decades. So you don't see my photo, but I have gray hair to show for it. And then my colleague, Carolyn Nosorge, works within our enrollment programs and services, and Scott Smith in higher ed services. And we'll be co-presenting on this webinar today, two of my favorite colleagues at the College Board. This is our agenda. So we're going to start with context and currents and trends. So what's going on in international student mobility, looking at that before the pandemic, and then examining how COVID has impacted what's going on, and then also hinting at what recent events around the election, what it foretells, as much as we can talk about that. And then I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues, Carolyn and Scott, to talk about the practical application and best practices of using lead generation, of using search. And in particular, we're going to outline 8 strategies for utilizing search to advance your goals in international student recruitment through data and evidence-based approaches. And we're going to open it up then for question and answer, have a discussion there. And I'll remind you, as we're going through the content, please feel free to put in the Q&A your questions throughout. That will help us get a good feeling of what we're going to answer at the close. So we want to make this interactive. Thanks. And so this first section, so just to give you a bit of background, that international student mobility to the US has seen robust growth for the last 6 decades. Substantial growth, but in particular, there was, after the 2008-2009 cycle, is where we saw a huge uptick, particularly in undergraduate student enrollment. And the end of the Great Global Depression, the election of Barack Obama, but also the growth of the upper middle class and upper classes in some key source countries, most particularly China and South Korea, but also Vietnam started around this time. There was also the Gulf countries, particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Qatar, they had always had scholarships, but increased the amount of those scholarships, so that also contributed to this uptick that you saw then. Now, that growth flattened out around 2015-16, and last year we saw some of the first declines. So we'll talk about that in a second. So recently, international student mobility has experienced some modest declines, really for the first time since, because even after that great global depression, recession that is, we really didn't see decline, just a flattening. The last time we saw a decline to the US was after 9/11, and the period of time near the Gulf War is when we last saw undergraduate declines in mobility. But last year we saw a 2% growth, 2% decline in undergraduate student enrollment, a little bit less so in graduate. We continued to see a strong percentage growth in OPT, the optimal training, practical training program that occurs after graduation, and a steeper decline in non-degree programs, particularly in English language programs. Next slide. Now, that change in international student enrollment of students arriving on campus for the first time had been in the works a little bit before last year's overall decline in undergraduate student enrollment. So the way that our colleagues at IIE, the Institute of International Education, through their Open Doors report, which is the Bible for international student mobility, what we really rely on to chronicle mobility overall, they calculate the overall cohort of undergraduate students across degree. But back in 2016-17, we did see among new students a 3% decline, and then the subsequent year, 17-18, a 7% decline. Last year it declined a little bit less, but we're now anticipating, due to COVID, somewhere between a 25 and 30% decline in new international students overall. Next slide. Now, what are some of the key issues there? So most overall growth in international undergraduate enrollment, so which can behave a bit differently from graduate enrollment, but search, we're all here for the undergraduate side. That growth derived since that 2006, 7, 8 period from only a handful of source countries, which I noted before, but particularly China. That's the big red section there within this graph, that within a compound annual growth rate from 2006 until now, China has recorded a 26% growth per year. Now that growth is slowed as you get to that scale, plus just the dynamics of China, the fact that their demographics are changing. It's not surprising their growth is slowing, but they're still showing positive growth, at least last year, up to 4%. Vietnam also has a very high compound annual growth rate, 15%, but also a strong year-over-year growth rate at 11%. So some of the same dynamics of China. So a more growing upper middle class and upper class that can afford American higher education, and attractiveness to that, and not that many English medium options in country. Also just a liberalization of their system in Vietnam that allows for more mobility. We're seeing growth in India, the compound annual growth at 5%, but the year-over-year growth at 6%. Saudi Arabia, which is more scholarship driven, so different dynamics in that mobility. And those scholarships under a new leadership in the country, in the kingdom, is reducing the amount and scope of those scholarships. So we saw a year-over-year decline of 15%, a very stark one. And for universities that were over-dependent on Saudi students, that hurt. But that had been a source of growth at 26% over that time period. The rest of the world, the compound annual growth rate is only about 2%, and we're seeing about a 2% growth, so modest. Next slide, please. Overall, there is about 500,000 undergraduate international students in the US, and that's a small percentage of our total volume. So looking at here, where are they concentrated? And primarily in high population states and the concentration regions. So, the West Coast, particularly California, Oregon, Washington, Cascadia, around the Great Lakes, and then the Mid-Atlantic and particularly the I-95 corridor. Now, Texas has a large number of students, and their universities, and universities in general in the Sun Belt, including in Georgia and Florida, Virginia, North Carolina, they've been seeing growth. But when you look at that second graph about the percentage of international students, that's very highly concentrated in California and Washington, and then the middle states, and the Great Lakes region. They have the highest percentage of students that are more dependent, and there's reasons for that. Okay, next slide. And one of the reasons for that is that most international undergraduate students, unlike graduate students, which are more subsidized, undergraduate students typically are self-funded. So more than 9 out of 10 are receiving funds outside of the US college or university. Only 9% of students are primarily funded by a US college or university. We are seeing more universities allocate funds strategically to diversify their student enrollment and attract the right match qualified students, but only only 9%. Most 84% of international undergrads, the primary source of funding, according to IIE, our partners at the Institute of International Education through their Open Doors report, 84% are coming from personal family, 6% from a foreign government or university, but that would be like the Saudi King, what used to be called the King Abdullah scholarships, or Saudi Aramco would fit into this. Oman, Qatar, Singapore has some of these scholarships as well. And then 1% is foreign or private sector. Next slide. And that's why you see places like the Midwest and Middle States where you see a decline in domestic enrollment, according to WICHE. Much of that decline in domestic, or at least some of it, has been replaced by a growth in international students, particularly among Big Ten universities within the Great Lakes region, and then those I-95 corridor big privates like your NYU's, GW, Drexel, Northeastern BU. I mentioned that more universities are allocating financial aid, both need-based and non-need-based, to international students. We've seen approximately 800 of the institutions, four-year institutions in the US allocate aid, and they allocate approximately 1.3 billion. We'll have new data on this for International Ed Week, but it's staying fairly steady in that allocation. That most universities that are doing this are doubling down on this as a strategy, as an approach. Now, this will vary, especially among private and public. The privates have a lot more flexibility, a lot more autonomy to do this. Many publics may not be allowed to give aid, or can only do so along the margins, and can only do merit-based aid or non-need-based aid as opposed to need-based aid. Next slide. Now, an elephant in the room would typically be what I mentioned earlier about an overdependence on a few key source countries like China and India, and overdependence on those for many universities, some of which have up to 75% of their international enrollment coming from one or two countries. So that's a risk. That's an elephant in the room. But also the politics of today, the new nationalism, which doesn't just inflict the US, but is affecting the UK. It's affecting China, the Philippines, and elsewhere, even India. That is creating an upheaval within student mobility and changing those patterns. That's another elephant in the room. And then the next elephant in the room is, next slide, is of course the pandemic, which will also disrupt the traditional flows of students. And what we were seeing as growth may be stunted for at least the next couple of years due to the pandemic. Next slide. But there is an opportunity right now created by the current upheavals for universities to really reimagine international recruitment and also reinvent themselves in their own profile within the international space, diversifying, looking at new approaches to frame their programming. And my hypothesis is strongly that most of our College Board International members, especially the most prominent ones, have a desire for international students. They want to welcome them. They want to sustain, enhance, diversify, and expand their international students' enrollments. It doesn't only help their campuses and their faculty, but it helps all of their students learn by having a global environment. Universities are seeking to support as they innovate and adapt their engagement during this COVID crisis, and that search is an underutilized resource that we hope you start to take advantage of. So our goal in this session now is to outline 8 strategies that will help you grow your international enrollment, diversify it, and enhancement in ways that helps your overall mission, your values, and your goals. Next slide.
Great, thanks, Clay. So I'm going to jump back in. Yeah, thank you, Clay. Clay has such a wealth of great knowledge of the international space. And so having that context set for this discussion, I really appreciate all of your commentary, Clay, and looking forward to taking you through these these 8 ideas that we have for you in boosting your international enrollment. We're going to start with just a bit of an overview. Whoops, go back a slide here. About College Board Search. You know, College Board Search offers the largest database of college-bound international students that's available to you. Through the international, though the international student population available in Search is really just 5% of what is a much larger domestic data set, there are still 186,000 students who are available in the classes of 2021 to 2024 who live outside of the United States. And last year, more than roughly 1,200 U.S. higher ed institutions licensed international names. And that represented just 3% of the total names they licensed through College Board Search. So while international students make up a small share of the database and the names licensed by U.S. higher ed institutions, that is certainly commentary to a large extent on the size and influence of the domestic data set of names and students in U.S. Higher ed search strategy. But you can certainly see here, most universities are using Search internationally in some shape. And for many of them, Search is their primary source of student data for these efforts. Now, as a team, we talk with so many Search users every day about their application of Search data to their recruitment goals. And when institutions track conversion rates by source and by geography, users are often telling us that when they use Search for international recruitment, those students who are sourced from Search actually display nearly the same conversion rates as their domestic search names throughout their enrollment funnel. And international students are now available with Interest in My College, and we'll expect even higher conversion rates on those names. And you'll learn more about IMC or Interest in My College in a few slides. Now, today, there are more than 186,000 students available in Search, as I mentioned, in the classes of 21 to 24. And on top of that, there are another 154,000 students from the class of 2020 who will remain available to Search until the end of August 2021. So depending on your institution's goals, you may or may not elect to make use of that group of recently graduated students. Since we know most of you are interested in those current cohorts, or the group who are still in secondary education, we'll focus on the 2021 to 2024 population in our comments today and in the numbers that you see on the slide. Now, this slide provides some context as to who these students are, where they're from, and other points of interest about that international search pool. So there are 235 countries represented among the 2021 to 2024 cohorts in Search. On the right side of this slide, a lot of data, and I recognize this is small print, but you will see the top 40 countries by student volume, starting with India, and then continuing down through the top 40. You can see here that we have the volume or the count of students by country, and then the percentage of the total international population that country represents. So these 40 countries listed here actually make up 84% of the entire international student data set. And so what we can learn from this is that some countries like India and China have large volumes, not surprising based on the data that Clay shared. Many more have smaller populations available in Search, but nonetheless, searching students from each of these countries can play an important role in helping you diversify your international student population. And if you've been following international counts in Search for some time, you'll notice that India has now overtaken China for the largest available student population internationally. And this is due largely to higher Search opt-in rates in India, even though more College Board exams are still administered in China. Opt-in rates internationally are pretty much on par, just about a percentage point higher than our domestic US opt-in rate.
So what we'll do now is talk about, oh.
Sorry, Scott, I was just gonna introduce you, so Scott's gonna jump in here.
Okay, so to help you and your team optimize Search to recruit international students, we've developed 8 strategies that we'd encourage you to think about. And the first of those is to consider being more intentional about the diversity of the geographies that you're searching. So we've seen during COVID and even before that institutions are taking advantage of the shift to more remote outreach, being less reliant on physical geographies, and expanding their search activity in areas that they weren't exploring before. So they're looking in areas that for them would be second and third tier cities, rural areas, new countries altogether, areas beyond their traditional feeders. It's important to note that within Search, we have students from more than 200 countries and territories represented. And so we encourage you to take advantage of this as you refine your approach to international search.
So jumping back in here for strategy 2, I want to talk with you about the new students who are now in Search as of just October 5th. So we're about a month into this, where students can opt into Search without taking a College Board assessment. So the ways that students can enter Search is certainly evolving. It's led the database to be even more dynamic than ever before. And so what we do is we invite students to opt into College Board Search online through a variety of channels at collegeboard.org, through Big Future, which is our college planning site, through SAT registration online. There are a variety of different ways a student might say, yes, I'd like to hear from colleges and universities looking for students like me. So now they are added to Search through a process called indexing, regardless of whether they have already taken an assessment. Now, indexing happens every Monday, so that means the database is constantly shifting and growing. Our assessment-related data loads now primarily add exam data points to the records of students who have already opted in. So on October 5th, when we first introduced these opted-in students without an assessment, nearly 70,000 international students in the classes of 2021 to 2024 were included in that indexed volume. Now that represented 20% of the total group of students who were added without an assessment, and it nearly doubled the size of the international student pool. It certainly skewed largest for the 2021 graduates. 60% of the population of international students added October 5th were students in the class of 2021. And we also observed that there was distribution across all regions. And this is good news for those of you who are conducting senior search and also who are looking to diversify your international student body respectively. Now, when you think about how to integrate these students into your strategy, you first might consider adding a segment to your existing search plans. You can order students the way you typically would. For many of you, that would include putting score bands on an order or even using a GPA qualifier. And then after you place those orders, because Search deduplicates against all your prior orders, you would then add another segment, put your international geography population on the order, and then in the College Board exam section, as you see in the top right screenshot on this slide, you have a new radio button option now to include only students who have not taken a College Board exam. So that's selected here in the screenshot, and you can see that when that selection is made with no other filters other than selecting all international countries and students in the classes of 21 to 24, we find about 60, almost 70,000 students who are in the database without the assessment. Now, your next step might be to then choose to add a high school academic performance filter, as many of these students have actually self-reported a GPA. More than 51,000, in fact, in the A to B minus range, which you can see in the second screenshot below on the right.
Strategy 3 centers around the use of a new feature in Search called Interest in My College, or IMC. IMC allows you to connect with students that have added your institution to their college list on Big Future. It's pretty well known that Big Future is among the most used college prep websites domestically, but we want you to know that a large number of international students use it as well. Over 55,000 students have created college lists on Big Future, representing 32% of the international students available in Search overall. So using this criteria allows you to connect directly with the students who, by adding your institution to their college list, are essentially putting up their hands, indicating their interest in your college, and hoping that you might reach out to them. Research compiled by campuses that are using IMC tells us that in general, these students apply and are admitted at a rate 4 times higher than traditional Search students. IMC is a subscription-based service, and you can learn more about it by contacting your higher ed services representative or a member of our enrollment team.
All right, the fourth strategy is all about timing. And I know there's a lot of data on this slide, so let me try to walk you through it. You know, our goal for you would be to talk to students as close to the point in time that they opt into search as possible. That's when we know that they are paying the closest attention to recruitment. And it's when your competitors, frankly, in many cases, start to build affinity with students. So ultimately, you want to be in that group of institutions that are reaching out to students as soon as they say yes, that they'd like to hear from schools. Now, what you see here in the middle of this slide is a bar chart that shows the volume of students who participated in search with each data load over the last 2 years. On the left-hand side of the slide in the white, we have the data loads over the course of the prior year, 2019, before the pandemic. And on the right side of the slide, on the purple background, we have the 2020 data loads. Now let me start with 2019. You'll see below the bar chart, there's a line graph that is representing the percentage of students, of international students, who were licensed by higher ed month by month throughout the year. And so this line chart relatively lines up to the data loads that you see above it. So what we might expect would be to see here, if we look at class of 2019, or the year 2019, that with the big data load of PSAT, which would occur in January along with December SAT, that we have a high percentage of higher ed institutions licensing international students at that time, 17%. Now we continued to load the names of students throughout March and May, and you can see that the licensing by higher education starts to drop off a bit, down to a low of 2% in 2019, at a time when we had a pretty good moderate number of students coming into search with that May SAT data load roughly around the same time. Now you can see that higher ed starts to spike again in August of 2019, which is not surprising given the kickoff of many application processes. But then you can see that more data comes in later in the fall, namely through the October SAT, as licensing starts to drop off again. So what this is showing are opportunities for higher education to sort of adjust timelines to match what the student opt-in looks like. And that would allow you to get your message in front of students without letting them sit out there and hear from competitors until they hear from you. Now, 2020 is a different year for sure. And so as we look to the purple side of the slide, again, higher percentage of licensing happening early in the year, again, mimicking US domestic strategy in many cases, and then really tapering off during the kind of the beginnings of the pandemic, not surprising, and starting to grow now. You can see we were up to 17% of licensing of international students by higher education in October. And so as we start to see enhancements in the number of students entering search through our opt-in indexing, and as SAT test taking resumes in places, we will certainly expect to see that trend continue. But I hope that this helps to illuminate where there's opportunity, and as you reflect on your own practices and when you reach out to international students, consider aligning it to what the behavior of the students is on the other end. Now, a couple of ways you could pursue this. You could set up a standing order where you set your criteria, a start date, an end date, and a maximum volume, and then get names delivered to you as the data loads. It takes the kind of the guesswork out of when students are coming in and has those names delivered to you without having to think about it. Or setting up your order and sweeping. So what we mean by that is going out to search, copying your order, and seeing how many more students now meet your criteria.
Strategy number 5 focuses on the use of AP information in your orders. So one thing that we see domestically as well as internationally is campuses not leveraging this criteria as much as they could. In fact, less than 5% of domestic orders use AP, and we see similar results for our international orders too. Colleges might be missing out on a great way to connect in a more targeted way with students, given what you can communicate to those students once you have the knowledge that they're participating in the AP program. And AP is offered in roughly 130 countries worldwide with 50,000 exam takers available in search. These names are released each summer. That's for both US students and international. Happens in late July or early August. And again, this offers a chance to connect with students months before they become available via other data releases, such as PSAT and MSQT. We see high opt-in rates among AP students in China, Korea, and other key source countries. And basically, we encourage you to take advantage of what AP tells you. Exam types often correlate with major choices or other academic interests. And so you have an opportunity here to develop more resonant communication for these students that will set you apart among your competitors. So definitely something worth exploring if you haven't already.
Strategy 6 is finding students who are already here in the US. And though we no longer collect citizenship data on our College Board exams, one way to capture international students already studying here is to order students in your primary market domestically using the high school address in the geography section of search, and then sort your output file for students with international home addresses. You can then segment communication and really work to identify who those leads may be. Now, for segment analysis service users, you might consider ordering students with an international home address, but an assigned US high school cluster, as only students attending US high schools can be tagged. So that's another opportunity. And if you are interested in discussing either of these strategies further, certainly reach out to your College Board rep who can talk with you more.
Strategy 7 is language focused. So if you would like to increase the odds that your recruitment efforts will reach students engaged in an English intensive curriculum, you can consider searching by high school within search. This will ensure that your order is limited to students attending high schools with a College Board code. And we find that most high schools with a College Board code offer an English intensive curriculum at your high school, so at their high school. So if that's important to you, consider exploring the use of search by high school within search. And finally, strategy 8 involves being aware of the many resources that College Board makes available to help you better understand the overall recruitment landscape, both domestic and international. Enrollment Planning Service, or EPS, is part of the College Board search suite that allows you to fully analyze the entire database of students that we have, both those currently in school, as well as the last several years of historical data. EPS lets you build reports that allows you to identify the types of students you're looking for, as well as your own score senders, and get detailed information on where to find those students worldwide. EPS data helps you better understand your various markets and answer questions around differences in test taking patterns, scores, and more. And many campuses use it to determine or even justify decisions around travel or other outreach. It's also used extensively to help campuses get a clear sense of their competition in other countries. So if you're interested, for example, of building a comprehensive report of your main competitor score send activity, even by country, then EPS can help you do that. We also would point you to the Higher Education Reporting Portal, which has recently undergone some redesigns. Just as with domestic students, new functionality helps you look at trends around international score sends, lets you look up score and essay information for specific score senders, and lots more. And the URL is listed here, and you can link to that via the summary reports page in search. Our higher ed services team can help you fully explore both of these tools, as can the enrollment team, of which Carolyn is a part. So we look forward to talking with you more if EPS or the Higher Education Reporting Portal is of interest. So to review our 8 strategies, we would encourage you to think about how you could incorporate these into your international search strategy going forward. Doubling down on global diversity, taking advantage of non-assessment names, exploring the potential of using interest in my college and identifying those students who are out there with you on their list via Big Future, increasing the frequency of international search orders, not forgetting about the value that could be uncovered in using AP as a criteria in your international searches, finding students who are already in the US, focusing on English proficiency if that's something that meets your goals, and enhancing the market intelligence available to you via College Board data. So now we'll proceed to Oh, go ahead,
Sorry,
Carolyn.
Scott. Sorry, I'm talking over you. We always like to preview our upcoming webinars. So we wanted to make sure that you knew of our next two opportunities that are coming up in the month of November. Next Thursday, my colleague Mark Barrett and I will be presenting a session called Cohort-Based Strategies Reaching Classes of 2021 to 2023. We'll be walking through each of the concerns, opportunities, and ideas for reaching your goals at each stage of your sort of enrollment pipeline from seniors on down. And then on November 17th, we'll have our colleagues from our Career Readiness Assessments team providing updates on November SAT and talking about SAT test taking that has occurred this fall and is underway, and also some insight for the PSAT, which certainly will be forthcoming in Search very soon on December 7th this year. So if you're interested in registering for either of these sessions or viewing any of our on-demand webinars, we have recordings from all of our past webinars this year. We've been doing webinars all year long. You can visit cb.org/HECOVID-19 to take any of those actions. So that brings us to our question and answer. So I know our chat boxes and polls are open, and Clay's going to take the lead here in moderating.
Wonderful. That, you guys, Scott and Carolyn, you did such a great job of outlining key takeaways and very practical insights of how search can be applied to enrollment management strategies, especially to outreach for international students. I'm particularly interested in that right in the middle, right in the heart of those 8 strategies, between 4 and 5. I thought there was a really interesting shift there, where Carolyn, you were talking about aligning strategies to meet students where they are, when they enter that search database. And Scott, you had built on that, particularly around AP, but making, I think I wrote down the term, more resonant communication that for international students. Could we unpack that a bit? Carolyn, could you talk a little bit more about how, because I see many folks on our call are from the US and are very used to the timeline for domestic students. Could you highlight a couple of key ways that international student trends are a bit different than our US database?
Yeah, absolutely, Clay. So, I think that one of the things that we have worked with domestic higher ed institutions and search users all year to think about is that search is changing in the way that students enter it. And so you need to change with it in order to truly take advantage of the data set. And so what I mean by that is I think kind of an archived way of thinking perhaps, or a more dated way of thinking about search is to go out and talk to sophomores and juniors in January, and then come back to search in August and talk to rising seniors. And that certainly those are the trends that we see and we have seen for a long time in the US. What we have found is that institutions who are reporting the best results from search are the ones who are searching more often than that, and are either making use of those standing orders to go out and get the names of students year round, thinking of search as a process, not an event. Those are the places that we see institutions reporting the highest returns and the highest response rates from search. Now, when it comes to international students and how that might look different, I think that you saw with this change of including students who have not taken an assessment in the database, and especially in this very different year, where when we look back at trends from a prior year, that may not necessarily serve us quite right this year in how we think about finding these students. International students, I expect to become even more dynamic given the increase in online opt-in. And by more dynamic, I mean dynamic in the way in which they enter search, coming in weekly instead of according necessarily to a data load calendar. Our data loads that you've been used to, if you've been recruiting international students using search for some time, you're used to the SAT administrations that have high concentrations of international students. Those tend towards fall SAT dates. We looked at the the chart that showed that October last year was a very big source of international student names. The spring SAT dates have been as well. But I think that you'll start to see those data loads really be additive in SAT data points to existing records. So the question that I think you need to ask yourself and your colleagues on campus is, are we better served to get those students in key countries where we have strategy when they become available, or do we wait and get that SAT data point? I think the answer really depends on who you are and what your goals are. But I think that there's a way that you can sort of layer in segments to your strategy where you can capture those students by score band or by self-reported GPA with that academic indicator first, and then build on that with those students when they come in. So maybe more than you were looking for, Clay. But,
no, I love it.
Top things that come to mind.
Great strategies, great granularity and detail there, and especially during COVID, where we're not as bound by geography. So whereas before many of our universities were engaged in digital outreach, but it was in support often of on-the-ground activity, fairs, visits, and other forms of getting to students directly, but in a particular geography. Now with other ways in which students can sign in into Search, we've really expanded, as Scott, you mentioned earlier, students from outside of just the major cities, which allows more outreach available to those second and third tier cities and even rural areas. Speaking of that, Scott, with moving on to AP, which I thought you did brilliantly, talking about that data load, which typically comes in July, allowing for getting the students immediately and knowing that major. Could you talk a little bit more about that and what kind of, and I want to move toward actually, yes, received some questions regarding what are some key markets that we see growing in that, but maybe you can start with the AP piece. Scott, I think you're on mute.
Yes, I was. Thanks, Clay.
Oh, yep.
So we've been talking for a long time with campuses about the value of AP in Search and the amount of information that you can get about a student and their intentions, their academic areas of interest, what they're likely to major in. One thing that I didn't mention when we were talking about it earlier was some research that we've done around the relationship between the exam type that students take and what they ultimately major in college. For example, if a student takes an AP course and exam in a STEM area, math or science, they are something like 10 times more likely to major in that area once they get to college. So what we encourage campuses to do is to perhaps consider the advantages of doing an AP STEM focused search and talk to those students very intentionally about STEM on their campus. Perhaps even putting them in contact with faculty members from the maths or sciences. And what that can translate into then is a communication that stands out from the rest when it gets to that student, something that isn't just a general piece about the university at large, but appealing to their interest in STEM and talking to them about the advantages of why pursuing a STEM major at their college or university would be a great thing to be able to do. So we encourage you to take that approach not only domestically, but to with international students as well. But even if you were just looking at AP students as just lead generation, just trying to reach out to the students themselves, AP is a really safe bet on a couple of fronts. Number one, these are college-bound students. They're putting themselves forward for college-level coursework in high school. They're the kind of student that you want to be talking to. And the best part is, and this goes for international as well as domestic students, is that being released in early August gives you a head start really to be in contact with sophomores or with juniors earlier than you might have been if you wait for their name to be released, in a subsequent, say, PSAT or SAT release months later. So lots of advantages in working with AP criteria in your orders.
I appreciate that. And I like that you also mentioned STEM campaigns or campaigns around different discipline. In our international cohort, it probably won't surprise many on this call that we're over-indexed toward science, technology, math subjects within AP. So your calculus BCs, your stats, physics and environmental science is a very popular course internationally. And we just have a larger percentage of students than we do in the US, where we have more social science, particularly around the history, US history and English Lang, not a social science, but those being our biggest subjects, whereas internationally, we lean toward STEM subjects. And we also have more students that are sophomores taking those subjects than we typically would have in the US. So a good chance to get them earlier. And Scott, you had this on your slide, but I want to kind of underline it. In countries like, say, a China or a Vietnam, where we might have a lower opt-in rate overall when students sign up for SATs for a variety of reasons, particularly if they use agents when they're registering for the SAT that might opt them out or not opt them in, that is. AP, they tend to opt in because it's the students that have the autonomy in that process and they want to be heard from. So in key markets, again, China, Vietnam, Malaysia, even India, we're seeing those opt-in rates are fairly high related to AP. So as we come into the close of this, I'm checking again to see what other questions we have. I would just like to highlight, and Scott, Carolyn, jump in, some key countries. We advise through search, not just to look at geography, but if you are looking at geography as a key determinant, how do you diversify beyond China, beyond India? Well, ASEAN, I think, is going to have a larger wave. So beyond, especially Vietnam, but beyond Vietnam, other countries within Southeast Asia, like Thailand, eventually Malaysia, Indonesia, even Cambodia and Myanmar will start to grow. For those of you who have some resources to expend in terms of financial aid, I strongly believe that Sub-Saharan Africa, especially in the West, but not just the West, so Nigeria, Ghana, Benin and Togo, Cameroon, these countries are showing growth. Again, particularly Nigeria and that Gulf of Guinea region, and particularly around business management programs. There is money there, growing upper middle class that can come to the US, but that will be the future. Don't ignore East Africa as well, particularly Kenya. Ethiopia is also expect more growth. And then the stands, eventually Kazakhstan and other parts of Central Asia, we expect to see more growth. So these are areas beyond the usual suspects where we expect to see growth. With that, I think we're about ready to close. Carolyn, do you want to help us close?
Yeah, thank you very much, Clay, and appreciate all your questions and the opportunity to talk with all of you today. I'm putting our contact information up on the screen, so please do feel free to reach out to Clay or to Scott or myself. We'd be happy to connect you to your College Board rep if you're not sure who that person is, or answer any questions you have. And as we close, we have a few questions for you. I'm going to launch a poll here so we can get your feedback on today's session and your experience with College Board during this COVID pandemic. But we look forward to sharing the recording from today's session and the slide deck. Look for that in the form of an email from us soon. And please do reach out as you have any questions that we can help and assist you with. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.